our project is entitled A Community-Centered Approach to Sustainability in Kalimantan. So the overarching question for our project was, what is best for the Kalimantan palm oil industry? But upon reflecting on this question, we realized it will be impossible to answer unless we consider the needs and desires of local community members who are directly impacted by the palm oil industry.
So here are 3 objectives that we're hoping to achieve with our project. First, we need to redefine sustainability and flip power dynamics to center the community and the surrounding community. Second, we hope to enforce existing regulations that aren't currently being enforced. And finally, we want to improve farming practices to address the root issues of sustainability. And on the next slide, you'll see how we hope to get there with our policy approaches. First, we want to create community boards to operate within the Ministry of Agriculture. Second, we want to make sure we audit farms to ensure compliance with existing regulations. And finally, we're going to provide education and capital for small farmers.
And so we just wanted to represent, so in this case, we're going to be representing as the Ministry of Agriculture, which is situated under the government in the Republic of Indonesia. And within that, we've taken on the task of creating the Department of Community Engagement and Restoration. And within that, department was going to spearhead 2 initiatives, that being the Farmer Education Program and the Community Advisory Boards. And so our policies will be led with equity, sustainability, feasibility, and resilience, and the community itself at the forefront of all of our initiatives.
To start off on our first initiative, we first wanted to lay out the strategy that we took to reach the policy idea that we chose. So we chose a community-first approach, which draws inspiration from the pre-existing concept and program of the community-based farm management and community-based conservation schemes, which have been in place in Indonesia since about 2001, and is essentially a collaborative model between government, corporations, NGOs, and local communities to make decisions surrounding land management, deforestation, and palm oil production. And this strategy supports for responsible governance, increases sense of agency over the system, and has had success in other countries such as Nepal and South Korea. And specifically in Nepal, these community-based farm management schemes were linked to reduce deforestation, lower carbon emissions, as well as a reduction in poverty. So for the communities who are specifically impacted right now in Kalimantan by the palm oil industry, they've been severely negatively impacted by deforestation associated with palm oil production, which has been associated with a loss of biodiversity, loss of food, and access to water, as well as indigenous culture. And is of course important to note that only 0.2% of land in Kalimantan in Indonesia is owned by indigenous population. So they currently have little to no voice or agency over what happens with their land. And kind of going off of this, although international organizations such as the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil claim to be able to certify palm oil as sustainable, in reality, many of these policies and programs are quite paternalistic. And in reality, this certified palm oil is actually associated with poor social outcomes for indigenous groups. And we also see several issues such as human rights violations surrounding child labor, as well as workers' rights with certified palm oil. So our solution to this issue and the basis for our community-based approach is to establish community boards, community advisory boards to engage with local communities in Kalimantan. So since corporations and governments have already expressed interest in more deeply engaging with local communities, we will be establishing community advisory boards under this Department of Community Engagement and Restoration, which will be led by smallholder farmers, government representatives, as well as representatives from large corporations who are in charge of the palm oil industry in Indonesia. So it will be funded and facilitated by the Indonesian government and the Ministry of Agriculture. And these advisory boards will meet to discuss policy issues surrounding palm oil production and land use, and community members will truly be able to inform policy and will be a space to work towards environmental and social equity for communities who have been left out of this conversation in the past.
And so the second part of our approach will be auditing to ensure compliance with policies that are already on the books in Indonesia. And so you can see here that 81% of Indonesian oil palm plantations don't follow regulations, according to a recent audit. That includes plantations that are larger than permitted, non-compliance with sustainability regulations, and not withholding land for smallholder farmers. And importantly, a previous audit found that the government doesn't have the capacity to enforce those standards. That's why they're not being followed. So our policy is to implement an audit system to make sure that those regulations are being followed, because there's not a policy gap in Indonesia. It's that there are policies, they're just not being followed. So we don't want to add more policies and add to a bureaucracy when the true issue is enforcement and monitoring. So the way this will work is that large palm oil firms pay into a collective fund. The fund is used to hire a private auditing agency. They will be the ones auditing the farms in addition to the community. Our stipulation is that the community must be part of that auditing process. We will leave it to the community board to decide how exactly would be best for them to be a part of that process, but we will propose that a few community board members will always accompany the private auditor to each farm as they do their audits. We chose a private auditor because there's a lack of capacity in the government, and also there's corruption in the government, but there can also be corruption in private firms, and that's why we hope that the community involvement will be an effective anti-corruption mechanism. The funds will be collected from the collective fund and then used to make sure that all firms are in compliance with labor and environmental protections. And on this next slide, you can see that auditing works. This is from a randomized control trial that was conducted in a state in India, looking at if audits reduced pollutants. And they found that audits were significantly correlated with reduction in pollutants in the country. And so here's what the auditing process will look like. If a large corporation fails the audit, they will have to pay a fine. But if a small farmer fails the audit, we will give them education. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next slide. And if someone passes the audit, then they'll have the opportunity to teach others at that farmer field school. And this will lead into the third prong of our policy approach, which is education and capital for farmers, because capital is one of the biggest, capital and education are one of the biggest obstacles to achieving prosperity. So we will have farmers that pass the audit, educating other farmers at farmer field schools, where farmers will be able to see modernized techniques for farming side by side with traditional techniques. So they can see that not only are modernized techniques more profitable, but they're also more sustainable. And then they're able to have autonomy and choose which one they would like to follow. And we'll also be providing microloans for farmers that do complete this program if they would like to receive them. The microfinance will be a partnership between the Ministry of Forestry, the Ministry of Agriculture and local microfinance institutions where the government can give a credit guarantee for 0% interest loans, and whatever the farmers don't pay back, the government will cover. Yeah, and I will pass it along to cost and financing team.
And lastly, we just wanted to wrap up by discussing the cost and financing, and we'll go into our three-pronged policy approach, because that is what's going to make our policy possible. So to begin our budget, we have estimated about $1.5 million that will be able to fund the three-pronged approach, basically that being about $7,000 going towards a community advisory board, because there will be one board per each of the 5 provinces, and there will be 3 members for each of the farmers, community members, and community leaders. And so these members will receive a $170 annual stipend for participating. Also, in terms of auditing, we have estimated that about $1 million will be required to hire a private firm to take on this task. In the farmer education programs, we have split it down between the training costs, microfinancing, and we've broken that down into various levels, seen below. And also, stakeholders are incredibly important, and we know that there are many that are going into this. We wanted to highlight these 4 because without their stake in this issue, our policies would not be possible, and we're working to try to see their best interests in mind with our policies. And those being corporations, Indonesian government, farmers, and the local communities. because corporations have indicated an interest in increasing their practices that
I'm sorry, your time is up. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm now starting
and we can just go to the timeline slide just to leave it up there for everyone to see, which is the next slide.
I'm starting on the 5-minute judges questioning timer now.
Thanks for your presentation. And I really like the idea of audits and having a mechanism for pulling in the, having the companies pay in for that. I'm wondering, how will you address, smallholders are a major driver of deforestation. How are you addressing stemming deforestation from the smallholders?
Well, we hope by teaching, I think a big part of that question comes into education and microfinancing, because if we have education so farmers know how to more sustainably farm their palm oil, then they can proceed in a way that is where there are better practices for the soil. So for example, right now, farmers have to basically uproot their entire plantation every 25 years. And then go to probably another pristine area and deforest that area. But there are other ways to make sure that the soil isn't degraded as fast. For example, by using the excess palm oil that's not being used in production, and by using that as fertilizer. So if we can teach techniques, then we hope that that'll contribute to that. However, I also want to note that a big part of this problem actually are other industries such as logging that actually are the ones responsible for deforesting, and then palm oil plantations just move into those already deforested areas. So.
Thank you.
I have a question also about the auditing and kind of building off of the idea that a lot of the palm oil is produced by smallholder farmers who are, spread out all over the place and not necessarily operating as part of groups. How do you propose auditing all these very small individual actors? I know we're hiring a private firm, but how would that actually work in practice when they're not kind of organized groups?
Yes, thank you for that question. We hope that the community boards will play a large role in that. As you can see from the flow of our presentation, everything really builds off that community engagement, because audits are being done by this private firm, but also by the community. And so they have those connections and they have the resources and those deep connections. And also that also goes into our last education section, because the community is doing the actual educating too. So community engagement is the thread through all of this. And that's also how auditing will be more effective, because they have ties to the community. And one more thing about the community boards, we will have one for each province. So it's a bit more localized to further engage with each local community.
So
I had it.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Michelle.
I just have a quick question about the financial slide that you showed. I think it might be a typo, perhaps. Just wanted to double check, because you said roughly 1.5 million, and then it looks like $5 million for training. So I just wanted to be clarify, where you were kind of dividing that budget up, or how.
Yes, our apologies. That was 100% a typo in terms of just, I think, between the numbers of 1s and 5s in the farm education program. That was just a mistake on our part, and we apologize. But essentially,
no, that's
bringing those all together, it would definitely bring us to definitely a much higher, about like 15, 16 million.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect.
So I had a quick question about, so you want to structure this through the Department of Ministry of Agriculture. So that seems like more of a centralization of policy, right? Because Indonesia is decentralized, so a lot of power has devolved to the district levels. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the role of local governments.
Right. So I think since, like you said at the end, local governments are going to be crucial to the implementation of our policy. And I think this reversal and maybe centralization in very local governments has not been done before. And that's why, and when you bring in local governments, you bring in their people and you can create really meaningful and lasting policies that are both culturally responsive, they are cater to the needs of the community members, and they consider their needs. And it's not a paternalistic approach. So by bringing it in a very local way and maybe doing something that might be different than what the Ministry of Agriculture, this, like you said, historically decentralized government has done in the past, I think it can be a great—
Time for questions is over. Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Good job, everybody.
Thank you
starting
so
the.
much.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
guys
much.
so much for joining. If you
Well
guys can
done.
if you guys can head out of the Zoom room, I'll start the 5-minute judges deliberation.